All right, so let's take this further now. We speak to Professor Keith Engel, the Chief Executive Officer of the South African Institute of Tax Professionals. Prof, good evening, and thank you so much for your time once again this week. When we were speaking earlier on in the week, you and I were chatting about the court case, right, and talking about how this can go either way. Yet, a couple of days later, here we are. Did you see this about it?
Yeah, no, I didn't. I thought that the ANC was going to fight this one to the last. And I do think that the ANC had a reasonable case. I understood the other case, but I don't think it was such a slam dunk that this was unconstitutional. But ultimately, it's a political issue. And frankly, on the politics, this one was a loser for the ANC. If they won it, they would have gotten resentment. And really, I think they got themselves too far in. They should have gotten out of it earlier politically. And again, the revenue service picked up some extra revenue to make it easier. That can be the argument. But I do think that the case, whether it's constitutional or not, what they did is still in question. I think it's really a 50-50 toss-up.
And I'm going to get to that in just a moment, but I want to stay with something that you said, because it was going to be my next question to say, how was all of it handled? Because as you talk about this, right, a lot of us have been saying that, this seems to be one of those moments that could be defining, with some analysts like yourselves also saying that this is more political than it is about any other matter. So let's look at the steps right up to this particular point. Has it been handled correctly, particularly by the minister?
Well, I think I'm not going to blame the minister. I think the minister really is part of an overall ANC. He gave a budget that raised the VAT because basically the ANC did not want to make cuts on the budget. They would rather raise taxes than make cuts. And that was really the decision, and therefore they had no choice. What they did get surprised at is they thought they could bulldoze their way through it, and that really was an ANC decision that, obviously, from what we can see, they said, well, the other guys will put up with whatever we give. So I really don't think the minister should be blamed for this. This is part of a larger decision. And I guess the deciding point is that the ANC won't always win. But I will make this note that this one was universally hated. So this was an easy one for the DA to win. But let's say you put in a different tax increase, a tax increase on the wealthy, or tax increase on the working upper middle, or some other tax increase that didn't affect everybody. They might have been able to get that one through. So this might not have, this was a perfect sport for the DA in terms of the politics, but other battles won't be necessarily so easy to win. But it does show you that we no longer have a one-party state. We are no longer in a one-party state mode, and I think that's the turning point.
And we were talking about Section 7.4, right, which when you read the minister's affidavit, Section 7.4 of the value added tax, of course, law, and he was saying that the Act does give him the powers to be able to do this. And of course, there is that caveat subject to Parliament. What does it mean now when it comes to that section as well as the minister's powers?
Yeah, so thank you for listening. You got my speech down right. I mean, in 7.4, before it was, they always knew they would have subject to Parliament. Parliament was always there. This was the first time Parliament wasn't there, and there was a question whether constitutionally, if you know Parliament's not there, can you proceed? Now the different debate is this. What I'm hearing is, even though the minister has pulled back on the VAT, there are a number of experts who say that legally you haven't done it legally, because you put it in the national budget. It's been approved, the announcement, as a national budget, and now you've got to reverse the announcement officially, and a media statement is an official reversal. So some say the VAT technically will still go into effect, but I will say, as a practical matter, I can't see the Revenue Service enforcing that. And so I think there's a lot of tempest in the teapot on that one. But technically, there may be a problem that it's too late to reverse it the way they did. But I just can't see it being enforced anything greater than May. That would be crazy.
So listening to something that you just said then, so some believe that this is not a done deal and it should go back to Parliament and then get to be discussed, particularly as we now saw it being the that fiscal framework that was then of course that came into question even in the court case itself. So can we see this go back to that process again?
Well, here's the problem. I don't think it's an issue for discussion. It's an issue for voting. So technically, 7-4 was complied with.
Okay.
That was the whole thing with Action SA and everything, that they said basically we've got that it's part of the public framework. It's part of 27 of the PFMA, and therefore the announcement was officially adopted. Now, the bottom line is it needs to be unofficial. It needs to be officially reversed. And a media statement is not an official reversal. And then the whole issue is, can you rush it through Parliament, even though there's not going to be any debate on the point, but can you get people to sit quickly enough to reverse it and get I'm not sure if you need the president's sign off on it, but you need a reversal of that. And technically, and you don't have a technical reversal. You have an emotional reversal that nobody wants to do it. But technically, it looks like it's gone into effect, assuming you believe it's constitutional. Now, again, the actual initial action might not have been constitutional, and you could argue that it actually isn't going into effect. So it's a bit of confusion here. Technically, it's a lawyer thing.
And now, when you and I were chatting earlier on this week, we're speaking about the constitutionality of it all, right? Something that you've hinted at the beginning of this conversation. So can we see it go all the way to the Constitutional Court, particularly with how now we keep hearing from the Democratic Alliance, for example, speaking about how for them it's unconstitutional to have a minister have this much power. So can we see it still, despite this reversal, can we still see it go all the way?
Well, the question is well, the thing was announced. Can they take it up? They might. But if I'm the Constitutional Court, I might say, look, this is moot. So you're asking me to declare on something that is moot because they've yielded. So I think that might slow them down. But at the moment, they are acting the way they say, look, the words are the words, and it's still out there. And, has there been a technical withdrawal of this? Well, there hasn't been a technical withdrawal, and therefore we can argue that it still needs to go forward. But I would argue maybe the Constitutional Court will say this whole thing is moot. It's for another day. But just the larger point you're getting at, the question is going forward. There are a number of provisions in the VAT and in the income tax and other acts that gives the minister a power, especially on rates, to make an adjustment before parliamentary approval. The real question is, we need to look at all of them and say, in a GNU environment, are these sustainable?
Prof, don't go too far. I think you and I will still be talking next week. Appreciate your time again this evening. That was Professor Keith Engel there, the Chief Executive Officer for the South African Institute of Tax Professionals.